Hi, guys. Welcome to The Social Block, the podcast that explores the intersection between blockchain technology and society. It's a very special episode today because it's been about a month since the Bitcoin halving, and I thought it's a good time to have a little bit of a play-by-play, see what happened, see what didn't happen in the space after the halving, and see where we're going from here. It's also a pretty special session because it's the very first time The Social Block has had an in-studio guest, and our guest is actually none other than Allen Farrington. He's the co-author of Bitcoin Is Venice, which is quite a famous book in the Bitcoin ecosystem. And I'm really excited about today's episode, so let's dive right in. So how are you doing today, Allen?
I'm very well, Magy. Thank you.
Okay, so Allen's joining us in our studio in Sofia, so I'm really happy to have him in person. And why don't you start off by telling us about yourself, about Axiom, about your writing?
Sure, yeah. So my name's Allen Farrington. It's interesting you set it up that way, yeah, because I have two completely different things that people might know me for. So on the one hand, I used to work in TradFi. I worked in TradFi for a very long time, 7 years or so before then quitting to set up Axiom. But in that time, my job didn't really have anything to do with Bitcoin, even though I was kind of personally involved to begin with and, just finding it interesting, kind of going further down the rabbit hole and so on. But then started to get more publicly involved even while I was still in that job. And it was kind of interesting trying to balance those without, getting in trouble, basically.
Yeah. It's hard to be a public speaker and not say the wrong thing because you have your personal opinion and then you have the company.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't so much that I would say something that goes against the company line. It was almost weirder than that. It was that for a long time, I wished that it would have something to do with my job. And you would think, I worked in finance, so it wouldn't be too hard to make that case. But we can maybe go into this later and kind of go further down this tangent, but it just didn't. Just the circumstances were such that there just wasn't any way for me to make it part of my job. And that actually then became kind of why I wanted to set up Axiom in the first place. So it was more like, how do I not even allude to what my job is in the first place? It's not so much that I would say anything that they would dislike. It was more that because they were separate anyway, I didn't want to draw any unnecessary attention to it. So I actually kind of went out of my way to only talk about things that were a lot more, philosophical in a way that, you couldn't infer anything about asset prices, basically.
So investment advice. We're avoiding investment advice.
Nothing I said could possibly be misinterpreted as investment advice. So I was making quite an effort.
Why does that sound familiar? Every day of my life.
It's good training, right? I mean, it was relevant in the job anyway, so it's not like I didn't have a good brief on that. But anyway, yeah. So in that time, I became, once I started to try to be more public, I initially became known as a writer. I had a bunch of, initially just like blogs, right? Medium posts as everybody does, but some of them were a lot more popular than I was expecting them to be. And then
How did that happen? Like, how'd they get popular?
People just liked them. I honestly don't really know. Like, it was.
So you weren't like distributing them on social media or pushing them anywhere?
But I didn't. It was really more for myself. Like, I didn't have any goal, right? I wasn't trying to achieve anything with writing them. It was fun. It was a way. I think a lot of people find this, especially when they start off writing, right? Like if they're not, a professional writer or something like that, that it's really more about organizing your own thoughts, at least to start with. Like you
explaining it to yourself.
Yeah,
almost,
exactly. Yeah. So that was my attitude when I set out.
Especially in that era of crypto and Bitcoin, it's like, I feel like there was less information at that point. So it really comes down to you figuring it out for yourself and just putting it down.
And also, especially, again, keeping in mind that the kind of stuff that I was writing, just people aren't familiar with anything I've written, it's not remotely technical, right? I'm not like, that's got very little to do with my persona. Even now this, now that I'm involved with Axiom, and I kind of do need to have more of that lens. Because it's kind of funny in hindsight, actually, that, I was deliberately pushing myself to be as philosophical as possible for the reasons I just explained, that there really wasn't anything like that. Which I think also made it quite fun because it was, if that had already existed, then that's what I would have read and be like, okay, I get it now. And there wouldn't have been anything to explain to myself in the first place. I think, to be honest, like, I don't want to pat myself in the back too much, but I think that's probably why people liked the stuff I was putting out earlier on, just because there wasn't, not that it was good necessarily, people still could have thought it was terrible, but at least it was relatively unique. So yeah, I don't really have a particularly good theory as to why it became popular. It's interesting that I genuinely wasn't really trying for it to be. It was more just fun. But then it's, you mentioned before, it snowballed into the book Bitcoin Is Venice. And at that point, it was kind of becoming a bit more serious as to like, okay, I don't need to, but I still enjoyed it. But I certainly want to at least lean into this a bit more and kind of at least attempt for other people to.
Did you get approached to do the book? Cool. Well, we've talked a lot about, I guess, your past, where you're at, what you're doing, but maybe we should get into our main topic, which is kind of looking at the Bitcoin, okay, the Bitcoin ecosystem, a little bit post-halving. So I wanted to start with something interesting. What were you doing during the actual halving?
Oh, yeah.
So, were you watching it, or were you like, totally out of space?
This is actually really sad. So where I was, I'm pretty sure it was at like 3 a.m. So I was literally just asleep. It's so sad. It's so uninspiring. But I remember in the few hours leading up to being asleep, I was having a lot of fun on Twitter, just kind of like hoping it was going to come faster. Although I guess one of the things I got into and sort of got a lot of enjoyment out of, let's say, in the past, I don't know, maybe 6 months. I forget when I started doing this, but it just, if the audience of this isn't familiar with my Twitter shenanigans, almost everything I do on Twitter is just really silly and stupid and shitposting, basically.
I did go through your feed.
It's almost entirely shitposting.
There was an egg on it at one point.
And so one of the memes I tried to kind of catalyze and hope others would pick up on was the date of the halving, right? Because it was looking for a very long time like it. I mean, from a long time out, it happening on 420 was very much on the cards, right? Which it did. Yeah. Well, it depends on what time zone you count it as happening in, I think, if I remember correctly. But so yeah, for a very long time leading up to it, I would post a screenshot of like a dashboard of when the halving is estimated to be. And if it was sooner than if it was like April 18th, say, then my sort of caption on this screenshot would be no, hash slower. And then if it was later, if it was like April 21st or something, it's like, no, hash faster.
So you went through all of that and then you missed it.
Well, I didn't really expect to have that enjoyable an experience, I guess. Just thinking about timings, like knowing where I was and like different events and things I was going to, it would have been, because I think I didn't actually ask like Peter or Danny this at all, but the Bedford conference was the most recent one that I was at, which was amazing. Had a really good time.
Yeah, a lot of people went to that. I think.
Yeah, it was great. It was really nice. It was also it was in the UK, so that was like far easier for me to get to than pretty much anything else I go to. But my suspicion was, because obviously you have to plan these things like months, if not years in advance. I think they wanted the halving to happen then, and it turned out it was like a couple of days later. So that was kind of what I was hoping for as well, that it would have lined up there. And then, but I was home by then. But the reason I laughed when you asked though is because that is such a dramatic comparison to the last one where it's not even that great a story, but it's more like it was a nice experience. And it was the first time actually that, just in terms of like the timeline, because things go in 4-year cycles, for the one before that, which was in 2016, I wasn't really involved enough to like know or cared or sort of appreciate the significance. Like I did know about Bitcoin then, but it wasn't sort of seen as anything social, if that makes sense.
I know, and I do resonate with that because I was so young. Like I just graduated high school and I knew about Bitcoin, but it just didn't mean anything.
Yeah. It was similar. It was similar for me, yeah. And so with that in mind, though, 2020 was really interesting because it was, I don't remember the exact timing, but it was very shortly after COVID had like become a thing, right? And lockdowns, maybe not everywhere, but where I lived, lockdowns. But I think actually for
pretty much everywhere.
People, yeah, just because it was very early on and you hadn't kind of broken free of all that yet. But I remember the response to that. I ended up, this is one of my earlier Medium posts, actually, when I was like making an effort to get this stuff out, and a shorter one too. I was making this point that the Bitcoin halving, not that particular Bitcoin halving, was kind of a bright spot in the nightmare of lockdowns, because it was precisely in contrast to what I described about me not really appreciating 2016, it was a social event that everybody worldwide was participating in.
Yeah, and it took place kind of like, it wasn't a physical event, but everybody was very connected.
And the circumstances meant that it kind of had, to the extent it could be social, it had to happen online, which for the most part is like horrible in terms of everybody,
everything else, like all the events, and it sucked. But
so that specifically was like a really nice contrast to, the world just going to shit, or so it seemed at the time. And even considering the topic too, right? Because I don't want to like go too far down this rabbit hole now. I'm sure the audience is well familiar with this anyway, but I would say there's a very large overlap with people who like Bitcoin and people who dislike lockdowns. So there's kind of
I agree with that. A lot of people went down the rabbit hole
too, of it being like almost in the dire circumstances, it almost feeling like a protest. So I remember that very clearly. I remember where I was and what I was doing. And actually, this is quite a fun connection. If you're really keen, you can dig up because I tweeted this. I filmed it and then I tweeted it. So I was tuned into some, I guess, podcast, but like live recording of a podcast with loads of Bitcoin influencers, I guess, just like, relatively well-known people in Bitcoin at the time. Were all, had all joined on Zoom, and they're just like having a chat, kind of waiting for the halving, and they had a countdown, or well, you can't count down exactly, but like a block,
watching it,
basically, right, and like watching it. And when it was getting close, I started when it was like one block to go, right, I started filming it, and I also remember that, as in just like filming it on my phone, what I was watching on my laptop and like feeling a part of, but also I had poured a rakia.
Oh,
and
you
it
were drinking rakia.
It was in Scotland. But
drinking rakia in Scotland, okay.
I make sure I always have rakia there. So if you really want to dig this up, you go back to like April, May, I forget exactly when it was, but 2020. You find this clip of me. I had poured the rakia, and then exactly when it happened, I cheersed. It was kind of sad, actually, in retrospect. But again, in the circumstances, right, you're like not allowed to see anyone in person. Cheers the laptop, and everyone was having a good time. So that was a good experience. This time around, I just slept.
You just slept. Well, I think I talked about my experience in the 2020 halving, because that was my first conscious halving, and I
think for a lot of people it was, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd only actually gotten into the crypto space in late 2019, so it was new for me, and I was working for Nexo, and I mean, I told my story. I'm not really going to bore listeners with it again, because I think the funnier story in this case was how I spent the Bitcoin halving.
This most recent one?
Yeah, it was crazy. And I just want to preface this by saying that I actually asked around the office, like, how did you guys spend the Bitcoin halving? And I had Eleanor, who had the same case as you. She really wanted to be up and watching it. And she stayed up and she stayed up and she stayed up, and then she fell asleep. And I think she must have been in the same time zone as you, because it happened around 3 a.m. She woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and it had happened already. And she was just kind of like, I was just so bummed, because that's impossibly early for her, and she actually woke up, and she was like, I tried to stay up, but I fell asleep. I tried to wake up, I didn't wake up on time. So she was bummed, but the rest of Nexo's employees, there was a couple of us who had suspicious automobile incidents right around the halving, myself included. So I was kind of hoping for the halving to kind of happen on the 19th, because on the 19th in the evening, I was leaving for a spa weekend with two of my girlfriends. So yeah, girls' weekend and all.
So you were going to use that as an opportunity to orange pill them. Is that the idea?
No, really, I wasn't. I was actually just trying to catch a break, but it hadn't happened yet. So I was like, "Oh, ladies, I'm sorry. I just kind of want to keep tabs on the situation for the first evening while we're there. You guys can go to the spa. I'll just be watching. I just want to see."
I can see that sounding very odd to them.
Yeah, to two women who aren't necessarily into crypto at all. They were just kind of like, do what you want. But that didn't come true, because we were driving around in the mountain. I don't know if you've ever been to the Riwa Monastery.
No, I know of it.
It's very pretty. But we were going to a spa hotel in that region, and shortly after midnight, right in front of the actual monastery, we took a wrong turn down this cobblestone road, and yeah, we were trying to go back. I wasn't driving, just to say. I'm a pretty good driver. I was not the one driving. But my friend that was driving, she reversed, and she hit some kind of sharp rock, and her tire just exploded. So we're three women at something past midnight in front of a monastery in the middle of the night in a mountain.
It was actually right in front of the monastery.
Right in front of the monastery.
That's quite but it's quite like or something.
Downhill. It was very much kind of like God's will, just stop women.
Exactly.
And we're 3 women. We've packed for a spa.
Did you feel compelled to go in? Like it seems like it was a sign.
No. I was like, I'm going in daylight. Right now, I just wanted to go into the spa hotel and sleep. But we're 3 women in the mountain. None of us have ever changed a tire. Like in theory, I know how. But my friend was just like, no, it's like it was really downhill as well, which is bad because when you put the car up, it might like start rolling down the hill. And we were just like, well, we can turn the wheel. We can do a lot of things, but we don't know. So we're like, okay. What do we do? And I was just kind of like, well, I think the road we needed was that way. And Google Maps wasn't working either, which was just even more insane. It was giving us this crazy road and it couldn't show us the road to the hotel. It just would pin the hotel. So I was like, so in theory, if we go down this shady
like
road.
over that mountain, that's how you get there.
Well, it was like a 30-minute walk or something down this shady little road in the mountains in the middle of the night. And I was like, ladies, take your suitcases, because we're going to a spa hotel where we don't have backpacks. And we're going to walk because I just want to sleep. I'd completely forgotten about the Bitcoin halving at this point. So we 3 women start walking through the middle of the night in a mountain, just hoping to find a spa hotel. No one, like there's these abandoned stations around and I'm just kind of freaking out because I'm just like, this is wrong turn. We're all going to die. House of Wax.
Do you know what this reminds me of? This is a good opportunity to boast about my being ingrained with Bulgarian culture, right? This sounds like something from Devil's Throat. Have you ever watched that?
Yes, I've actually, yeah. I've also actually been to the cave that's called Devil's Throat.
Really? Ah, cool. Yeah. I want to now,
it's pretty cool,
seen the
yeah.
show.
What I also did is there's another cave nearby where you can actually go rafting in the cave. Oh. Yeah, so I did that. I was like 11.
Like, now that they've had the show, though, people maybe are a bit scared of that, but...
I don't know. But yeah, so I completely forgot about the halving. We walked down this dark road for like 30 minutes. There was only one car that passed us and it didn't stop and it had all like blacked out windows. And I was like, I'm kind of glad he didn't stop. Like initially I was like, what a bastard. And then I was like, oh no. That I would have freaked out if he had stopped. I was like, well, we didn't get eaten by a bear or a wolf. But by the time we got to the hotel, I was just completely freaked out. And then there was my colleague Stella. So I asked a few more people from Nexo, what were you doing during the halving? And one of them was Robbie, who was like, he said he was driving down the highway, watching the countdown on his phone, and he almost crashed. I was like, Robbie, stay safe, please. There was Stella, who's apparently calculated that, so a giant branch fell on her brand new Audi the night of the halving at some point.
That also sounds like a sign.
Yeah, I was just kind of like, what is going on? And then there's Christian, who, bless his soul, he said, for me, the halving happened while I was waiting for French fries with vegetable powder at a local pizzeria in my hometown. I was like, oh, Christian. That was like the most wholesome one. Honestly, everyone else was like, I'm almost died. I almost got murdered by a bear in the mountains or something. But yeah, I hate to having experiences. I feel like Joe, who was on episode 18, who was like talking about the halving, he was like, oh, I'm going to do a big party in Poland. And I'm like, everyone else is just kind of trying not to die over here.
Or sleeping.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. Or you and Eleanor.
The next one will be good. It'll be a party. It needs to be timed more politely, I think.
Yeah, I think it's
very
difficult,
rude of all
though.
the miners.
He's like, gosh, guys, come on.
It was nice of them to do it on 420 like we asked, but...
Yeah, but like it was, depending on...
That'll never happen again, so...
So what do you think expectations were in the space for the halving, right, like before the halving, and do you think they came true or rather didn't happen?
I honestly don't really know. It feels a bit, this time around at least, it feels a bit anticlimactic because obviously everybody gets psyched up for... oh, there's a supply shock, and then there's this endless, we don't need to go into this, but I'm sure you're aware, endless debate about to what extent it's priced in, and then you end up having the meta debate about, you know, what does that even mean? Like, do you believe in efficient markets? Blah, blah, blah. Whereas this time, yeah, I mean, it doesn't really seem like a whole lot's happened, and I feel like it's probably my very amateurish theory about this, because I try not to... honestly even pay that much attention to the Bitcoin price. Like it's unavoidable that I will be aware of it. But I try not to, obsess over it, spend too much time actually thinking about it. It seems like it was pretty dramatically overshadowed by ETFs. Like that,
yeah,
that seems like much more important.
I also think people were so enamored by ETFs that, I mean, yeah, and like the ATH came like well before the halving, which also happened in 2020 as well. Like we had Bitcoin hitting 10K then. But yeah, ETFs were just really all over the place before that. And There was some hype for sure, but it was
Yeah, but I feel like this, if anything, is probably healthier going forwards. That the hype has now become more social than anything. That's my impression, at least. Which is cool because exactly, the conversation that we just had, right? That like in 2016, probably for most people wasn't really a thing. I mean, I'm sure the people who were far more involved in the space than either of us
right.
were,
Yeah, probably
it will have been more of a thing. But I think part of it is that there just weren't that many people, so it's more difficult to turn it into a social event in the first place. Then obviously 2020 was just destroyed any aspect of, at least in real life,
not talk about 2020
around it.
Although I think that was a lot more hyped up a halving than this one. Exactly, because people were locked up. They had nothing to do.
Yeah, but I think, there's maybe even a link to the ETFs here too, that I feel like I'm kind of tiptoeing around the whole, the meta debate of like, to what extent can anything ever be priced in, blah, blah, blah. But obviously every consecutive halving is just almost by definition less economically important than the previous one, in the sense of what it means for the price given supply dynamics, right? I guess unless you somehow think that, this is all just coming to me off the top of my head, but unless you think that basically there's no transaction volume at all, and hence it's entirely dominated by, like, the supply dynamics in the market are entirely dominated by miners selling, right? Which I think is kind of unrealistic, not only, just theoretically, because that would probably mean that, you wouldn't, it wouldn't be possible for there to have been any growth in the network, either in usage or, number of people involved, number of applications, and therefore price. That just doesn't really seem plausible to me. So as long as the price is going up, as long as more people are getting involved, surely the transactions, and obviously then you get down to the fees in particular.
Yeah, which everybody is scared about, which is like,
but it's a good thing.
It's a demand thing. Yeah,
exactly. But the more that goes up, the more the less, just by definition, the less the block reward and hence what's going to miners will have to matter. And I think there's an even more interesting angle.
Also like a little bit. I think people oversimplify because there's like, oh yeah, Bitcoin miners are selling the Bitcoin they get for profit. I'm just like, you realize that these are smart people, right?
Well, yeah,
they're not getting those 3 Bitcoin, selling them immediately. Probably they are to some extent, but like
to some extent they have to. But I think this is something worth being really excited about. This has got nothing to do with the halving. This is just like as time progresses. It'll affect future halvings. That's kind of my point. That the more mature and sophisticated capital markets around Bitcoin get in the first place, the less miners will have to sell, which is great, because then, at that point, you're basically saying, well, actually, the halving doesn't even really matter anymore. I think it'll probably be a while before you can say that realistically, but
I think it's always going to be an event. Like people are aware of it.
Well, yeah,
I talked about it last
social
time.
Event. That was my point.
I talked about it last time in terms of I like to think of it as like in a dystopian world, it's going to be like Christmas.
Yeah.
Well, why not?
It's like, do you know what?
We celebrate something, right?
So it's like without it getting too dark about it, but it would be like Christmas in Soviet Bulgaria, right?
Ooh.
Where you're not really allowed to celebrate it, but everybody does.
Yeah,
that's what it's going to be like.
You don't tell on the neighbors.
The more to shit the real world gets, the more the halving is going to be like Soviet Christmas. That's my thesis. That's your tagline for this whole episode.
Oh my God, this is already going to be very interesting. Title: The Halving Soviet Christmas. This is your next book.
Yeah,
why the Bitcoin halving is like Soviet Christmas.
The gears are turning on how I'm going to write about this. Yeah.
Oh my God. I had a different thought about, first of all, I just want to tell our listeners something that I learned that was really interesting. And I actually mentioned it to Alan earlier, but he was like, I don't really know anything about that. And I was just like, apparently there's something called the Epic Satoshi, and there's all different Satoshi. Yeah, he's laughing because he's already like, this shit.
I know about it. I
had no idea.
I honestly don't really care.
I was shocked. I was like, this is one of those like Bitcoin lore things where I was like, so this is basically the first Satoshi after each halving.
Yeah, you gotta be careful with that though.
Okay,
this is like tiptoeing into why I don't.
He says he doesn't care, but he has an opinion.
Well, yeah, okay, I can qualify that a bit more carefully. I do have an opinion. I'm hesitant to give it because I think the topic itself is so dumb that it doesn't merit.
I think, yeah, I don't know. I was really like, what? This exists, and apparently there's like a common Satoshi,
okay,
uncommon.
I have to clarify though.
Yeah.
This is why I started laughing that. within Bitcoin itself, there is no such thing as a first Satoshi.
Well, yeah. This is it's a social construct.
You need to be subscribing to Ordinals theory to even agree as to how to, distinguish what that, not even distinguish, but like, it only has meaning in that context. It doesn't have meaning in Bitcoin itself. And a lot of people get very upset about
I think
this.
the thing that...
I don't get that upset about it. I get a little upset about the extent to which people may deliberately obfuscate that distinction. The topic itself, I don't find that interesting, but this is kind of what, like,
I like the social dynamic.
I find so silly.
Yeah, I find the social dynamic. The reason I brought it up was because we were talking about miners and like the way they sell and stuff, and like, what I was reading about was like basically the auctioning of the first epic Satoshi, because I'm not so much interested in like whether this actually exists ontologically in the Bitcoin ecosystem technically, or who subscribes to what. I'm interested in like what it's doing in terms of the community that Bitcoin is. And I was just kind of like, so I think they sold it for like 2.1 million. It was one of,
I think it was like 33 Bitcoin, something like that.
I mean, I wrote it down, but you guys can look at, there it is. It was, I think, Viabit that mined it, supposedly, because you said that could be disputed, and it was 2.1 million to the highest bidder, and I was like, this is like already one of these things in the halving where like we've taken a natural Bitcoin process and we've, I don't want to say gamified because it's not gamified, but we've already got these like social engineering things around it.
So just be clear, I think that side of it is definitely interesting and is kind of cool. What I find silly and annoying is that any of my attention was sucked into the debate around it in the first place. No, not by you. I mean, obviously this all happened, when it happened, mostly, from my perspective on Twitter. An interesting perspective on it, though, is that I think something like this is probably inevitable as Bitcoin itself becomes more normalized.
We're looking for a way to structure something that is already very structured. I feel like Bitcoin, like, it has its own life. It has its code. So, it's got a very strict structure. But yeah, I do understand that like Bitcoin has its own life, but like societally, we're trying to put it in certain boxes and we're layering over stories and mechanisms.
I think is great. I mean, that means, completely out of context, that process means it is becoming more societally ingrained. You can then get angry about, a lot of people get very angry. I try not to, but a lot of people get very angry about how the concepts that are being overlaid are communicated, which is, I think, is fair to the extent you are. I do understand
that. Yeah, we do try to like, not we, but I guess there's a lot of different factions in the ecosystem that will, like you said, misrepresent basically the, what they're talking about. And they'll talk about it almost as if like this is something that's an inherent part of Bitcoin, where no, it's like something that someone built on top of Bitcoin or something.
I think that's a good way of actually, that's a good setup for clarifying how I feel about this, which is that it's only really the misrepresentations that I dislike. It's like, as long as no one is misrepresenting anything, then it's probably a net good, I would say. But even that, like, it's inevitable.
I'm a little bit worried about the fuss. Like, I like the social dynamic, but I'm like, what's all the fuss about? It's a Satoshi. Yeah, I don't know. I'm a little bit, every time there's hype about something that's technically fungible, I'm a little bit like, doubt. That's something. But we talked about expectations, and I was thinking about what actually was going on. I was thinking a lot about like previous halvings. Obviously, I wasn't quote unquote around in 2012 and 2016 because I was a child. But I looked back at what was going on, and I mean, maybe 2012 isn't as relevant because I didn't really get a lot of information there. But 2016, 2020, and now, and I feel like there was the same dynamic in terms of what was happening. There was like, the debate of like, are, a lot of miners going to drop out? Is Bitcoin going to become less decentralized? There's the overpriced, is it not overpriced? Is it already priced in narrative? But price-wise, I feel like especially in 2020 and today, it was kind of the same. Like we had the ATH a few months before the halving, and then on the actual halving, not much happened. And then after that, like 6 months to a year after that is when you get your big bull market. And I'm just kind of like at this point, I'm probably oversimplifying it for sure because I'm not a trader. I'm 100% sure that's true. But what I don't understand is I was looking at headlines in the space because I'm a communications specialist right now, at least. And I was looking at mainstream media and crypto media, and I feel like there was a lot of after the hype, after the halving happened, mainstream media were like, there was this one Forbes headline that drove me crazy: Bitcoin halving 2024, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Oh no! This infuriated me so much.
Stuck in our narratives from 1 or 2 halvings ago. Like, we're all over this, but
exactly.
And also they're that far behind anyway.
They just kind of, it doesn't serve them. Like, I guess it depends on who owns the media and like who they're rooting for.
This is such a cliche with how it ends up being communicated in mainstream media anyway, that this is because I would never see that directly from Forbes. I would see people making fun of Forbes on Twitter about this.
Yeah.
Because it's basically like, the classic thing you'd attach to this is 2017's FUD, right? Not this one specifically.
Well, there were some neutral ones. Like, in all fairness, like Reuters were really neutral about it. They were just like, the Bitcoin halving has taken place. CoinGecko says.
Probably the
I
best.
Love that. That's so neutral, because you're just like, I don't have an opinion. I'm just telling you what happened according to whom.
But I think that's the most. I mean, especially if it's being reported in a financial context. That's the healthiest way to tell. It's like, this happened, by the way.
There were some miscoms as well. I'm not going to say the media because...
why not? Come on, let's not call them.
No. I'm not going to do that. I have a very specific reason not to do that.
Okay.
But the headline basically said Bitcoin climbs after supply halving, which just is not true, because the supply is
well,
not...
again, how far behind are these people? They don't know what they're reporting on.
I think in the actual
place.
article, they explained it well. But yeah, so in the mainstream media, I was kind of thinking of it as like a... Okay, so they're kind of like, oh, but why is there no boom? Why is there no wow? Where are the fireworks? Whereas like crypto media was a different story. They were going crazy. Like, there were CoinDesk article after CoinDesk article about transaction fees. Like, within the first hours or days, they were like, transaction fees have gone up because Runes launched on Bitcoin. I mean, that was it, right? Wasn't it? Runes like really pumped up transaction fees, and everyone like, this is like really bad. They're too high, blah, blah, blah. But then literally a day later, they're like, transaction fees back to normal. And you keep
in mind what their incentives are, right? Like, if that's a thing to report on, they're going to report the shit out of it.
Yeah. But like this is where
doesn't matter if it actually matters or not.
Well, expectation versus reality.
It happened. So
for me,
that's an article.
Was like, the expectation versus reality for me in this sense was that, like, on the actual price action level and on the building and mining level, on all the halvings, things were pretty stable, especially the last 2 halvings, the ones that I experienced. I was like, things are very stable, which tells me that, this space is fairly maturing, that the ecosystem is strong and it's healthy and it's calm. But the communications around it, oh gosh. And it makes me think that, like, maybe in this context of blockchain and in Bitcoin as well, even Bitcoin is the most mature blockchain, the people who are doing the doing are not the same people who are doing the talking.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And I think that's kind of an issue, because we get so much, I don't want to say that there was a lot of panic around transaction fees or runes or whatever, but I'm like, I think we need to think about the responsibility of news and how we communicate that, because I think it's repelling newcomers, honestly. They're coming in, they're just like, what is this fiasco? There's always something wrong. There's always something going on, because that's the nature of news, right? Even if something isn't really wrong, you want to blow it up a little bit. And I'm just like...
There's a fun link here, actually, to something I mentioned earlier, right? That the vast majority of what I do on Twitter is shitposting. And mostly that's just because I find it fun. But it is somewhat deliberate as well, because it's my way of reminding myself that Twitter is not real life. And I find myself saying this a lot, or not even when I say saying, not necessarily in public, right? Not in a tweet, but almost as a way of evaluating, what I make of some other debate that's happening. And it could be something like this, but I think it applies entirely across the spectrum. It could be some very involved technical debate about, software proposals to Bitcoin, for example. But the fact of it happening on Twitter and what incentives that drives in terms of how people engage sends conversations in completely unhelpful directions. And I observe this and I'm just like, oh, guys, come on, Twitter's not real life. What are you doing?
Yeah, I'm very uncomfortable with Twitter and social media in general, which I think people probably wouldn't notice or think about me, because I am trying to grow my Twitter, we even have a TikTok channel for the podcast.
Oh, cool. I don't know what like Bitcoin TikTok is like.
I don't either, to be honest, and I'm the person posting in it. It's confusing to me. I'm uncomfortable with social media and that I think people take things very seriously there. And I don't live in social media. I live in the real world. And as funny as it seems, like we talk so much about metaverse and all these like digital spaces and stuff, and I'm such a physical person. Like the minute I close my laptop, I forget that all of this exists.
Yeah. Well, that's you're aware.
I want to live my life.
Twitter's not real life.
Exactly, but that's what makes me so uncomfortable. Is because I feel like people do the opposite thing. They think that that's everything. So anything I post there, it's kind of, I feel very like I might one day be obligated with it, and I'm just like, it's Twitter. Like,
yeah, I have a good hack for this, by the way. You might do this anyway, but just anyone listening who's worried that maybe they have been tricked into thinking Twitter is real life. I don't have it on my phone. I only have it on my laptop, which means that I have to make a conscious decision, not just in time, but also like weirdly in space as well. It's like I need to go and sit on the couch and deliberately open Twitter, and like that's my Twitter time. Do my shit posting, get off, and then real life again.
I mean, I have it on my phone, but I don't open it. I also have TikTok on my phone. I don't open it. This is the thing about me. This is how disconnected I am from social media in my mind, that I have it on my phone because sometimes I'll be like, oh shit, I forgot to like post something, and I'm out, and I'm like, I want to say I left my laptop because I don't actually do that very often. But I'm just kind of like, it's just easier to do it through my phone. But I don't open it because I just don't even compute, like, when I leave work, I'm usually headed to a dance class. And when I'm in a dance class, I forget that all of this even exists.
Good, as you should.
Except for sometimes when something really bad happens and I actually get a phone call or something, I'm like, oh shit, and it just sits down immediately. But that's different.
I think, by the way, there's a serious point that you can, like, we're obviously joking about this, but there's a serious point that can be made about how people ought to think about Bitcoin in the first place that I think is I don't think this or, you know, say this in the way that I was describing about like Twitter is not real life is a really good slogan to just kind of remind yourself to have good behavior. But this is in the back of my mind, and I have spoken to people about this kind of thing privately, that I think in the very, very long run, you know, the reasons that people are excited about Bitcoin, I guess other than number go up, right? Other than like, oh, I'm just going to get richer and richer forever, which is a good incentive. Like, I'm not knocking that. That's a very good way to at least get people in and you know, try to keep them involved. But every other perceived social benefit of promoting Bitcoin, I think it's unhealthy to lose track of that actually being the end goal, as in Bitcoin being an end in and of itself rather than a means to other ends.
Exactly, yeah. We talked about this a little bit in a previous episode with Aragorn, who we talked about how blockchain and Bitcoin in that sense as well, it's an abstract thing, and people a lot of the times they're just like, oh, we don't even need to like talk to people about like what it is. They should just be able to use it to have a smooth, seamless life, essentially. And I subscribe to that in the sense that, I mean, no, I'm not sure that we shouldn't explain to people why they should be using blockchain technology, and we should be like moving into currencies like Bitcoin. I very conflicted here.
I see
on the front end.
I think there's two.
You should have a life, and like having Bitcoin should be a means to a better economic situation for everybody, easier payments, all sorts of like things that you shouldn't necessarily have to think about so much in your daily life. You shouldn't be like tied to your Twitter. Or your Reddit or whatever it is.
I think there's two completely different angles you can take on this that aren't, they seem contradictory, but I don't think they really are in practice, right? So one is that it should be as accessible as possible for anybody who does want to learn about it, right? Like that, and that's almost fundamental in terms of it, you know, being free and open source software in the first place, right? So that's on the one hand. But on the other, I think the further and further out you look, it doesn't make sense to assume or envision hyper-Bitcoinization, let's say, or just the normalization of Bitcoin, the gradual becoming ingrained into society, if you also assume that everyone has to understand it. Because the whole point of, well, I shouldn't say that makes it sound like there's some kind of, you know, almost deliberate purpose behind it, which, if anything, that's kind of the point, that because there isn't, because it is actually decentralized, right? People should, in the very long run, they should have to care about it less and less. I think that's almost, it's sensible to think of that as being a marker of its success, that people are using it without even necessarily realizing.
Yeah, I think this is where you could kind of define it as, think of Bitcoin as, I guess, infrastructure for living, life infrastructure. Because it's just kind of like financial systems we have today. It's kind of like money, you know. If you just remove paper money, but you think of it as that's Bitcoin. Yeah, it's digital, it's out the way and everything, but it's an infrastructure that's in your life. It's a system.
I thought of an even spicier take on this, by the way. I've also just realized we've gone this entire time without me using the word fiat, which is incredible. If people know who I am, but we're breaking that now. That if anything, I think is a very sensible and easy argument to make that having to think about money all the time is a very fiat construct, right? This is something that is forced on us by fiat. And in fact, if money were, you know, we're getting into kind of Austrian rabbit hole here, but if it were sound and if it were censorship resistant and blah, 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 all the qualities that we like about Bitcoin, as a matter of fact, you just wouldn't think about it that much. You'd in fact be freed up to think about your dance class or whatever else.
Oh God, man, dance classes. I don't know about that.
But your real life, right?
I think it's not
even Twitter's
fiat,
not
though.
real life. It's like, I don't want to say money's not real life, but money should not dominate your thought.
Yeah, your physical life, your actual.
It should just work. I think this is one of the very last things we say in Bitcoin Is Venice, the book. Like I don't remember the word for word what the line is, but it's in the final few paragraphs. We say something like, it should just be like plumbing, right? In a sense,
it just works.
Yeah, it should just work. Metaphorically, it kind of is plumbing. It's like, not that
that's the point of infrastructure,
but it's like, it's infrastructure, right?
And this is the problem,
it should just
though,
work in the background.
Yeah, the problem with that, though, is that people don't realize that it's working well and that they need it until it's gone.
True.
And they don't know that they want it until you give it to them and it works perfectly.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. Well, that's why thinking about money all the time is fiat. So
speaking of money, I mean, maybe we should actually touch on price. I'm not big on talking about price, but I was reading some headlines about Bitcoin about 2 weeks after post-halving being some sort of danger zone, and that ended on May 13th. What do you even make of that? It's because I feel it did have a bit of a dip, but I did not perceive that to be so dramatic, you know?
I honestly, I don't want to say I don't care. I do have to care at least a little bit, but seriously, I try not to be aware of this kind of thing. Because it can just, this follows really nicely actually from exactly what we're just saying, that I feel like if you're quote unquote in Bitcoin, and what that consists of is that you actually spend all your time thinking about the price of Bitcoin, I don't think you really get it. Because that's very much what the price is. I mean, there's so many, now I'm thinking about this, there's so many layers. So on the one hand, you shouldn't even, maybe in the short term, it matters to you what the price, but implicitly as quoted in dollars or euros or whatever, right? You should, should. In my opinion, it is healthier to envision a future in which things are priced in Bitcoin in the first place, and you're not pricing your Bitcoin in dollars, right? If you price your Bitcoin in dollars, or
because then
you're thinking of it as a short-term speculative investment, even if you don't realize it.
It's an investment asset. It's an asset. It's not money. If you're
you're not really treating it.
Yeah, if you're denominating it from something else, then you're not treating it as money. You're treating it as an investment.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're in Bitcoin, but that's all you do, I'm a bit skeptical about whether, not you, one, right? If one is in Bitcoin and one does nothing but this, I don't think you really get it. I don't think one really gets it.
I mean, I guess, I don't know. I was a little bit just shocked at the headlines because everyone was like, oh, it's gone down a little bit. Am I the only person who's just
I know exactly why it's gone down. Do you want me to tell you the secret?
Yes.
That at that moment, marginal supply was higher than marginal demand. And so the price had to move for it to clear. This is what I say. I tease people about this on Twitter.
Oh, that actually.
It's just it's classic. A complete non-answer, obviously, but I like it because I encourage the audience to do this. By the way, if they ever get in this debate with anybody, just if they demand an answer as to why the price has either gone up or down, just be like, well, supply and demand.
Because that's always going to be true. No matter what the situation is, it's that's always going to be true. And it's the same thing with people wanting the halving to kind of. Is it priced in? Is it not? Isn't the point of the halving is to make it a scarcer asset that becomes scarcer and scarcer over time. So obviously, even though technically the incoming supply, the new mined Bitcoins are going to be coming in at a slower rate, that takes time to reach.
I think there's a nice distinction here too, right? That at a very high level, everybody understands why it's important. Right, and obviously it has to happen. It's crucial for how it functions. Well, at least how it functions in monetary terms, let's say, in terms of enforcing the supply cap, right? But that, acknowledging that and even being excited by that and finding reason to celebrate it, as we were talking about before, turning it into more of a social event, that's all fine, but that doesn't translate, I honestly think, really at all into, therefore, some or other kind of technical analysis about exactly what the fiat denominated price is going to do. I think a lot of people, it's like Twitter's not real life. A lot of people feel pressured, it would seem, to opine on this and to have to take a view, which to me is kind of, it's almost like, it's like missing the forest for the trees. Like, you can just sit back and enjoy the social component. This is why I hadn't articulated it this way earlier, but I think as I'm now thinking out loud, this is why previously I was celebrating it becoming more of a social occasion, because that, it feels like, is the appropriate way to celebrate, in the sense of that's more in keeping with the spirit of Bitcoin in the first place, rather than obsessing over the price.
I feel like also there was a really good point that you made in there, and it was that having happiness or having hype, whichever you would prefer, doesn't necessarily translate into a lot of people buying more Bitcoin, aka more demand.
Yeah.
And I think that, we've seen it over and over again, that there isn't this big run up, or at least in 2020 and 2024, there isn't this big run up right up to before the halving. There isn't a big run up after it. And I think that's normal, because you need an actual reason for people to suddenly want so much more Bitcoin. And I don't think that everybody's a speculative investor. Right?
Do you know what's nice, though, that I'm actually now realizing this? It's going to sound like I'm maybe walking back the previous comments, but it's maybe more, it's focusing on different people are going to be at different stages in terms of how they're coming into the ecosystem, or maybe they're not even in the ecosystem at all. It's just a question of, do they own Bitcoin or not, right? That it is, as much as I enjoy almost being kind of like in my ivory tower and knocking the people who don't really get it, right? It's still very useful, the fact that it is a news event. And even going back to all the, the headlines you were reading, we were making fun of them for not understanding it. But that doesn't really, that matters from our perspective, but not the perspective of their actual audience. So it is still a good thing, because it's giving, not obviously crypto media is going to report on it, but it's giving mainstream media an unavoidable reason to basically shill it for us. It kind of doesn't matter if what they're saying is making any sense.
Because it's exposure.
Exactly. It's exposure.
Yeah, this is exactly what we talked about in the last halving episode, right on the eve of the halving, where we were just kind of I'm not a big fan of hype, but I do understand that we need it for adoption. Basically, that's just your way of wheeling everybody in.
I think I get what you mean by you saying you're not a fan of hype. You can maybe explain that in more detail in a second, but to my mind, at least, if I were to say that, I'd mean something like, I'd rather be accurate in how I'm describing it, and not, lean into exaggerations or whatever.
Well, exactly.
else.
Yeah, my issue is with the hype is that it's always overly emotional. It's always hyperbolized, and I'm just come on.
Yeah. So that's all fine from our perspective, but if we can basically trick no coiners into doing that for us, that's amazing. That's okay, well, you take the, you put the cost and effort and presumably not caring that much about anywhere near to the detail we would around the accuracy of it, then that's perfect. That's they can do all of the evangelizing for us without even meaning to. We can stay in our ivory tower and have the far
and
more...
laugh at them.
yeah, exactly, and laugh at them. And have
this is awful. Yeah. It's especially awful for me, because I do work with mainstream media, and I know some great journalists who are actually really smart, techie people. And I've had a few situations with them where they want to write a really good story, and they write it up, and we talk, and I'm just I'm happy for you to share that content, and then their editor will change just the title into exactly the opposite of what their story is.
Nonsense.
Hypey, or just crypto negative, Bitcoin negative, blockchain negative. And I'm just kind of come on, well, you have usually this is young journalists and working for mainstream media. It has happened to me a couple times with crypto top tiers as well, but it's young journalists who are really into the space. They understand it. They write fantastic pieces, and their editor just puts something really scandalous at the top for clicks, or just to kind of make it, I don't know, maybe that aligns better with what those media want from, in terms of what they want to convey for crypto. And I feel why do you hire these brilliant young people if you're just going to put them down? If you're going to ruin their effort to actually put proper information out there. It just drives me wild. Okay, so we're talking about the halving and the future and everything. How do you see things going down the next halving in 2028?
In terms of what, like, because there's obviously all sorts of angles that you can have on it. Like we've covered, what's
like your favorite
social
one?
Element.
Yeah, well, what's your anything that you think is going to be interesting?
For the next halving, well, I hope it's at a time when I can celebrate it. That's honestly maybe the most
you
important
thing. Hear that,
thing
miners, please.
Yeah, exactly. Please, miners, like do us.
Alan
do
will
us a solid this
shitpost on
time.
Twitter, and you'll see it. And
yeah, the next shit posting will be not around the date, but it's going to be even more specifically around the time. No, honestly, I mean, I'm a bit wary that this is going to sound like kind of a non-answer, but I think it follows nicely from what we have talked about, that I'm honestly looking forward to it just mattering less and less. Like, I think it's really healthy that it becomes more of a social event, because if anything, actually, we can tie it exactly to the comments you've just made there, that the more it just becomes social, for somewhat technical reasons we've discussed, that it becomes less and less relevant in monetary terms, let's say in terms of Bitcoin's
prices.
Monetary policy. But I'd say even prior to prices, right? Like therefore you'd expect there to be an effect on prices, which is also healthy. But the more that it becomes people's expectations around the halving, the less of exactly that kind of coverage I think it's going to get, whether it's either just negative on crypto in the first place, because that's maybe a bit more involved as an argument. Like maybe you think that's just never going to go away because there's people who just hate it.
No,
right?
I think it will go away at one point, because I mean, when it becomes like super mainstream, like mass used, and like with institutions coming into it, I feel like these institutions are so rich that once they're in it and they want it to go up, if they're in it and everything, they want this ecosystem to flourish. I don't really think there's going to be, the issue.
I hope so, yeah.
Media
Yeah.
not like wanting to put it.
But I think you can maybe even trace this directly to the stuff we're talking about at the halving. It's a bit tenuous. Like I don't think there's perfectly causal relationship or anything. But the less the halving comes to be seen as a financial event, essentially, right? Like, and as a result of which there's specifically speculative hype around it. I can imagine that certainly in probably 2016, they didn't really know enough to cover it at all. But for the previous two halvings, that being a source of like the ultimate source of the negativity, because I would imagine, maybe you have other things in mind, but I would imagine that the somewhat ill-informed negativity is basically around like, oh, this is just all nonsense. It's like basically gambling. This shouldn't have any value, blah, blah, blah. It's, to me at least, it's pretty easy to see why, which to some extent I do kind of agree with. I just think that, it's framed in a very unhelpful way. Because I also agree that you shouldn't, I mean, this came across in previous comments, maybe like a few minutes ago, that I don't think you should see it as as like a short-term investment, or that if you do, you should be prepared to get wrecked, right? I think you should see it as money that will replace fiat over the next 10 to 100 years, something like that. And if you have that attitude, that's why I'm joking about like, I try not to care about the price. But if you flip all of that and you do care intimately about very short-term movements in price because you're essentially speculating on it, and then that's the lens through which you see the halving as being beneficial to that, I can see why no coiners, let's say, would react to the halving negatively, because from their point of view, its only purpose seems to be driving speculative mania, rather than what I would prefer for them to cover it as is like, not even social necessarily, but it's like, what is the source of the social celebration? It ought to be a celebration.
Why are people happy that this ecosystem is growing?
Yeah.
That it's developing, that it's getting better and
well, not even that. I think yes to all of that, but even more fundamentally than that, it's a celebration of the soundness of Bitcoin's monetary policy, right?
Yeah.
It's and kind of in a bit of a more intangible way, it's a celebration of the fact that it is, proving by its operation, its robustness and its decentralization. And like that's, I think everything follows from that ultimately. And so having an actual, I think, but what's really interesting about the halving though is that those points are very theoretical otherwise. And this is like a classic trope anyway, that it takes years to, have studied enough in various different areas to even appreciate what I just said. But the halving is probably the only time where it becomes an actual occasion that, reminds you of this. And that I think is why it's worth, it's a good thing that it becomes more social than financial, because it in that happening, it's sending a better message in the first place.
Yeah, I think the last thing that you said over there, it really lined up with what I was saying earlier about how I feel like the people doing the talking in the Bitcoin space right now are not the people doing the doing. Because if you see it, how, like, it's just everything is so stable, so just a non-event essentially around the halving when it comes to prices. Even like miners, yeah, transactions are going up and down depending on things that are happening, which doesn't really depend on miners anyway. But yeah, it's just kind of like everything is fine. Everything is working. All good. It's just, no news is good news, in other words. But the talking element, like just the rave that's going on in media and stuff. And I think it would be cool if in the future that also kind of just calms down. So like we just talk about it in a different sense, like maybe even just a social sense, in the sense of like why it matters, but not, oh my God, what is going to happen? Is the price going to go up? Or miners going to like drop out of the game? Is the network going to become less secure because of that? Blah, blah, blah. We need to stop that because obviously it's working. I think it'll happen but
naturally, though.
Just stop talking.
Like, I think it's a very weird circumstance that I can't think of anything to helpfully compare it to, and that, as we've covered already, I think the long-term vision is very much that it just fades into the background, right? This is just something that works, people rely on it, and, Bitcoin fixes everything, right? As a result, the world becomes a better place. But at the same time, there's a very small number of people who not even own it, but even understand it to any degree whatsoever. And so it does have to be evangelized in order to get there, right? It's not going to happen.
You need a certain level of radicalization to get anywhere.
It relies on social interactions. It's not some kind of, entirely natural phenomenon. It's a social institution that needs to attract new members. And so I completely agree. It's kind of it's an awkward tension, but I think at least at this stage it's somewhat inevitable. I don't feel like, obviously you can, and I share this, by the way, finding a lot of it, cringy and wishing the messaging was different and so on. You can, find it distasteful, let's say, and try to counter it with superior messaging or shitposting in my case, right?
Well, that could be superior. Depends how you look at it.
Yeah, but I don't think it makes any sense to, wish it just wouldn't happen at all. Like it is.
Well, no, I don't want us to shut up about it in general. I just think we have better things to talk about in the Bitcoin ecosystem, including just better narratives about the halving, and less psychotic panic. Panic calm, you know that meme? So I know that me and, well, not really me, my colleagues, actually, I was that person involved in this initiative that just kind of like got saddled with doing all of the business as usual work while everybody else goes and does this thing. But a couple of my colleagues, shout out to Stella, Eleanor, Valentina, a couple of the other guys as well, they put a lot of effort into launching a Bitcoin emoji petition for the Bitcoin halving. Like that's what they did. And I thought that was just such a good perspective on it because again, it's about the social element. It's about the communications element. It's not about the price. It's not about, what's going to happen to the network. It's not about fees. It's just about getting it out there. And I know you supported that, so I wanted to ask,
massively, yeah.
Why do you think Bitcoin deserves an emoji?
Oh, there's a whole bunch of things you can say. I mean, I think it's an amazing initiative. It's when it was presented to me, I had this kind of weird reaction where like, why hasn't this happened already? Like, why didn't this happen 4 or 5 years ago? Which I think
that was their whole thinking. They were like, what?
Exactly. But I think the obvious answer is, well, nobody did it. So obviously it's great that now somebody is trying to do it. And that's a perfect link to exactly the previous answer, right? That this isn't going to just happen naturally. It's not a natural phenomenon. It's a social phenomenon. Somebody had to realize that, this specifically around the emoji hadn't happened yet and should, and therefore the effort ought to go into it. So I'm very, very happy to support it. Will continue to do so to whatever extent I can actually be helpful. I think it's there's an interesting link too to one of the more recent answers around the social relevance of the halving. I think there is a similarity here that's worth touching on, that I forget exactly how I put it, but I said something like, a lot of these concepts are very intangible. The halving is great because it's an actual occasion to link them to, right? It forces people to think about them. And I think I was going to say the emoji, it doesn't exist yet, but when there is an emoji, that will be a very similar thing because it's so much more immediately relatable for people, and it just provides yet another means of being ingrained in media.
I do have a little bit of a little disclaimer start.
Okay, sure.
I doubt this is gonna happen, but I always every time someone's like, "Oh yeah, Bitcoin emoji," I'm like, "Yeah, that's great," and then I'm like, "What if people use it for the wrong reasons?" Because there's so many emojis,
I honestly
specifically
don't think that
foods that we use for the
right.
Well, yeah, because it is getting.
You mean what if it takes on some
other meaning?
We maybe need a specific example to evaluate how funny it would be,
but it's still getting the message out there.
I honestly think, at least insofar as this goes, maybe it's a bit more complicated around what are the narratives around the financial metrics of the halving and so on. That's a bit more involved, but for something like an emoji, I do kind of feel like any news is good news. Mm-hmm. I think the main reason to be excited by it, it's not that, I, Allen, can now send slightly shorter messages because I can use the emoji rather than having to spell out Bitcoin
facilitating your shit posting
BTC or whatever. That's not the point at all. The point is making it significantly more accessible to people who maybe wouldn't come across it otherwise. And I'm now thinking that there's potentially another similarity to the halving in that if this were to come to fruition, I think it's probably inevitable on a long enough time horizon. But again, I do want to credit the people who are putting the effort into actually doing it now. If and when it happens, that's news. That event would be news that mainstream media would have to cover. And that's fantastic.
And is that nice kind of neutral news in terms of the actual network and the price and everything? I'm really excited about it. We are submitting our, I think it's a proposal that you have to submit to Unicode. Mm-hmm. One of my colleagues has it all written up. I've actually seen the draft and you're in it.
Excellent.
You have a quote in it.
I'm going to put that on my CD if it comes through. Quoted in a Unicode, what even is it? Proposal. Yeah, I'm sure there's some technical lingo for this.
Yeah, she was so excited. She posted it in one of our channels, and she was just kind of proposal go brrr here. And I was like, oh
no. That's really good.
Printing the emoji.
Yeah. It must have I don't expect you to know this off through your head, but it must have a name. It must be proposal number or something maybe letters. I don't know, but
let me see.
That should be its own meme. That's we can start. I can share
that's
a good
one. Well, because it hasn't been submitted, I don't think it has one. The name
I don't know
right
how
now
the process works, but it must.
That's a good idea
some
for
way of being referred to, surely.
Yeah,
almost. We can then turn into a meme.
Proposal number, blah blah.
Yeah.
That's quite good actually.
Get it on T-shirts and stuff or
caps. Nice. Yeah, I'm really excited about getting the emoji. I'm also I'm low key also excited for its own the meaning it's going to take on its own because we're all going to use it for Bitcoin in the beginning for sure, but then something really exciting could happen and it could become, I don't know, the emoji for something really significant or something big or something bad. Hopefully not. I don't want it to become the emoji that people use for bomb or something. That would be terrible. But it could be good. So I'm just if we're gonna find an alternative meaning, I hope it's something nice. And this is the kind of thing that you don't control, not unless you're ready to put a lot of money into popularizing that. It's just something that people take on. It's kind of like memes, memes that make themselves.
I was thinking that it's precisely on brand for that reason as well, right?
Exactly,
it definitely fits the overall brand of Bitcoin. And in such a way that, again, just makes you feel like this is just weird. It doesn't exist already, but it should, and it will.
Yeah,
we're going to do it.
In all honesty, I had a moment where I was just like, doesn't it exist already? Because of Twitter with the hashtag.
Yeah.
And then I was like, oh. So technically somebody, I think, had a thought about that before. Somebody. We all know who that might be. Well, no, I don't know if this was his... when he took over, when Elon took over X Twitter.
No, it was definitely Dorsey's thing. It happened when Dorsey was still there. Yeah.
Well, good on Jack Dorsey. Yeah. He does not give me anxiety. I always think that Elon does. But yeah, so I'm kind of excited about that. And I think to wrap up our episode, I always ask my guests what they want to leave our listeners with, what message, or sometimes they like to promote their stuff, but usually it's a deep philosophical message that they give people.
I think it captures loads of what we've talked about. It's just Twitter's not real life. right? So that's kind of a glib answer, right? But we did touch on what I think is let's say a more philosophical interpretation of this, which is that I would heartily encourage everybody to whatever extent they care about Bitcoin, try to think of it as a means to some other, preferably social end, which is, far more involved. Like Twitter's not real life.
I think I would expand that a little bit. Like if Twitter is not real life, I would say Twitter is not real life, but Bitcoin can enable real life.
Yeah,
something like that. Because I think that's kind of the gist of what we were talking about, how it's basically going to be your life infrastructure.
So what you're saying is Bitcoin fixes this?
No, I actually think like Bitcoin has made...
You don't think Bitcoin fixes this?
No, Bitcoin has
Bitcoin fixes everything.
Bitcoin is Band-Aid. Have you seen those memes with like the fish tank or whatever that's leaking and there's... That's Bitcoin.
Yeah.
I've seen those a lot because they're just kind of like dance. Like just like, okay. But yeah, dance jokes aside, it's more that I actually even have this feeling that Bitcoin has made people think that Twitter is real life more, which...
It may have, yeah.
I get it. It's almost like a necessary evil, but then I think we have to outgrow that and then take Bitcoin and be like...
it's back to the...
Put it back into like enabling our lives rather than enabling our...
Evangelizing.
Yeah, exactly.
As much as you want it to be, naturally, perfectly decentralized, it has to actually happen socially, at least first. And Twitter's a natural hub for that. So it's...
Yeah. In general, digital spaces, social media are good for that. And I think that's why it got like kindled there. Like that's what its cradle was. Social media, I think for sure was Bitcoin's cradle. But I think it's time to take it and like use it in our real lives, bring it there and live with it in the real context. Is that anything else you want to share with us? Or?
No, that's a nice note to end on.
Okay. Well, thanks for listening today, guys. That was our episode on post-Bitcoin halving, and join us next time on The Social Block.
But then it's, you mentioned before, it snowballed into the book, Bitcoin Is Venice. And at that point, it was kind of becoming a bit more serious as to like, okay, I don't need to, but I still enjoyed it. But I certainly want to at least lean into this a bit more and kind of at least attempt for other people to...
Did you get approached to do the book, or was it like your prerogative?
Yeah, I was actually. It was very nice how that happened. It was kind of weird in hindsight, actually, that... Because of the unexpected success of some of the articles, and in particular one called Bitcoin Is Venice, and so that's why the book became titled that, just because it had its own like brand basically at that point that we wanted to.
And that's because of the Renaissance, right? Like.
Oh, we can get into that. Yeah, it's but basically yes, it's a very silly analogy.
I don't think it's silly.
Well, but the way I'm explaining, I even say at the start of that article that it's.
I don't know. Maybe
it's not serious.
It's
right?
the way. Well, yeah, but it's a good starting point, and I guess it works with the way my brain works because I like history, I like art, and I'm more of a conceptualist, like philosophical mind in the crypto space, also not technical. Yeah, I mean, I have read parts actually of the book. I haven't read the whole thing, and like all the bits by the different authors, but I do, like, I am familiar with. I call it part of honestly Bitcoin lore because it is quite famous, right? But it resonates with the way I function as a more conceptual. Yeah, well, I like that. I think we all need a little bit of narrative, a little bit of story, but it works with the way my mind works in terms of explaining the crypto space and the reasons we should have it. I think it's definitely not the way miners' minds work and devs' minds work.
Oh, definitely not. No.
Because
I don't make any pretense.
Those are usually the people who are like, what is this? Like, why am I even dealing with this right now?
Yeah.
They're looking for the technical, but I lean into that a lot.
Yeah. But so what happened then was, so that was unexpectedly successful. That got the attention of Bitcoin Magazine, who invited me to speak at Miami 21, it would have been, on the basis of, basically a bunch of people there had read it and liked it, I guess, and they asked me to do a talk that was in some way connected to that. I wasn't just like turn this into a talk, but this is that, which is completely accurate, right? That at that point, that was basically the only thing I was known for. So, try to keep it on brand. And then when I was so I was very grateful for that. It meant I get to go to the conference for free too. So
it was a good conference as well. Like I remember we sponsored it. That was the famous conference where we did. We had like a banner on a bunch of boats with whales on it.
I don't remember that.
That was great.
Yeah.
And we had taxis for people.
Because that was the one where it was the first one in a while because of COVID. It was the first one that they managed to get going.
And it was really bombastic. It was like, I just remember people being kind of like, there was a lot here.
Yeah. Well, it was where the El Salvador announcement was. That was was like the finale of the whole with Jack Mallers presenting on stage. So yeah, it was really exciting. And so yeah, when I was there, I got talking to them about, I don't really remember exactly how this happened, other than my impression of it being very kind of casual and fortuitous. Like the whole, I mentioned before, even when I started writing, I didn't really have a goal in mind. It feels like that just continues throughout the entire progression. Like every next step is just an accident in all of this. But yeah, I was just chatting to them about the writing of that article, because obviously that was the connection to get me there in the first place. And I mentioned that I had been considering trying to turn this into a book, but hadn't really taken any steps to do so. I didn't really know what would be involved. And it turned out to be amazing timing because I don't think they're called, I think it's BTC Inc. or something. They're the parent company of, Bitcoin Magazine and the conference organizers had been wanting to get into publishing anyway. And it didn't happen like right on the spot, but I do remember this impression of them being really excited. It's like, oh, cool, maybe we could do that. And then there was a bit of back and forth after that. It was like a couple of weeks of, negotiations effectively. But as it turned out, fast forward, I think almost exactly a year, because the point of the timing of the release of the book was to launch it at the conference the following year. But Bitcoin Is Venice, and then Alex Gladstein's book, he's written so many books now, but Check Your Financial Privilege, that was the name of his first one. They came out at the same time, and they were the first two books that Bitcoin Magazine had published themselves. So that's how that came about, which I was really grateful for, because I know nothing whatsoever about publishing, and it was kind of funny that conversation was basically me saying that. It's like, it'd be kind of cool if this is a book,
nice.
but I have no idea how to do that.
Oh yeah, I get into the situation a lot myself, where I'm just kind of like standing around. Did it in uni all the time, where I'm just kind of like, I'd be interested in like maybe helping you out with your film project, and then it turns into like a 6-month stint filming in a bar or.
Well, that's actually, it's funny you put it that way, because that is almost exactly what happened. That as soon as this process got going, I say we because there's a co-author on the book too, a good friend of mine called Sasha, who, in just interesting detail, actually, we know each other from that TradFi job, which he's still in, so he's actually still kind of a bit more under the radar than me. I've kind of broken free, and I can say whatever I want on Twitter now.
Allen is free.
As soon as that process started, the very first realization was, okay, well, we need to write a lot more now. It wasn't just a question of, okay, we'll take this and then we'll just kind of, I don't edit it, I guess, but take this existing batch of writing and just slap it into a book. Like we knew we had to fill it out quite a bit. I think also we kind of wanted to as well, because for the reader's benefit, to sort of not take the piss on why we're making it into a book in the first place, that we did want it to feel new. Like we wanted to give people a reason to even want to buy it in the first place.
Exactly, because if it already exists anyway. It's not just like repackaged
Medium posts that, now you have to pay for them.
I don't know what your academic background is, but purely from an academic point of view, there's so much to say and learn about Bitcoin. And I feel like, especially in that context, filling it out, there's so much potential in the philosophical and conceptual context, because I'm always like, right now I'm writing something that I'm hoping is going to get published with some ladies from an association that Nexo partners with. I'm not going to give a lot of details. Okay. I'm not sure to what extent I'm allowed to just say it, right? Given the publisher and everything, but we're writing some chapters together, and every time I get into my very academic brain, the more I read, the more I realize what I'm going to say. And the more I write, the more I'm like, I could poke 6 holes into this, and I need to tell you about every single one and why it matters, or why it doesn't necessarily mean it's the end of the world for, this application of blockchain. So I don't know, whether that was kind of something that happened to you when you were writing. You were just kind of like, there's so much more I could say. Because it makes sense. If it's an essay and you're going to publish it into a book, you can fill it out so much. There's always more.
Yeah, I think there's probably two sides to that. So on the one hand, because what had already been written makes up such a small proportion of the book. I mean, it's probably something like, it's not tiny proportions, maybe 30%, something like that, just in terms of, I don't know, page count maybe. But So from that perspective, it was nice to, knowing that we wanted to fill it out, exploring what avenues, were available. But on the other hand, there was an enormous amount of editing that went into it for exactly this reason, that it's, I think we probably didn't do ourselves any favors by making our topic and kind of our remit so poorly defined either, that it was fun to just go in basically every direction, and then at the end of it all, there was an enormous amount of quite grueling thinking of, okay, what can we get rid of? How much of this can we in fact get rid of? Because we just kind of splattered everywhere, and now we need to make it more coherent.
Yeah, which always brings me back to my thesis supervisor, who was just kind of like, Magdalena, what you're planning is a PhD. This is your master's. And I'm just kind of like, oh, no. But I really, really want to write about this very specific niche thing. And she's like, no.
Yeah.
You need to leave that out. Stay focused.